Chapter 3. Died? I whispered, surprised. The doctor laid an arm across my shoulders. Dr. Holmes had been the doctor's employer during his medical residency, and the two had remained good friends afterward. I remembered him as a kind, grandfatherly gentleman who always took an interest in me and Crash. Now the doctor's brows furrowed and he bit his lower lip, which I understood to indicate sorrow, but he only said, "What does that have to do with you coming here?" Shaking his head, Crash gave an odd smile. "I'm not quite sure myself, but I need to talk to you." He didn't say in private, but I understood. The doctor frowned. "I can't talk right now. I have a patient in there. Tonight." Crash nodded, and the men grasped hands again. Abruptly, the doctor turned to me. "All right, you've had your fun. Now go do your job." "Yes, sir." I was looking forward to being present at the confrontation between the mischievous, daring Crash and the practical, cautious Gilders, which was always a source of amusement. "Talk to you later, my boy," said the doctor brusquely, and he hurried back into sickbay. I beamed at Crash. "He must be even more glad to see you than I thought. He hasn't called you my boy in years." "Yes." There was an absent look in his eyes for a moment that puzzled me, but in an instant it was gone, and a look of fun flashed in its place. "Going up to see the captain and Gilders, are we?" "Don't be surprised if Gilders doesn't jump for joy when he sees you." On second thought, we should go visit Elmira first. She'll give me a hug and call me honey and get me cheered up to go see the grumps upstairs." "No," I chuckled. "You've already gone against regulations by visiting the doctor before reporting to the captain." "Now, Andy, have you ever known me to follow regulations?" "No time like the present." His only answer was a good-natured laugh. With an exaggerated bow and a "lead the way, milady," he followed me up to the bridge. When we reached it, Crash stepped out in his usual cocky manner and announced, "Crash on the bridge, sir." The captain swiveled his chair around. "So I see. It took you long enough to get up here." He pretended to disapprove, but I could tell that he was just as pleased as any of us to see Crash again. Gilders, however, didn't even turn around. "Yes, Trent, good to see you too." In 5 steps, he was beside the chair and was wringing the captain's hand. Turning to wink at me, he looked in Gilders' direction. I giggled as I slid into the navigator's seat again. Loudly, he said, "I can see by the way Gilders flew up to greet me that he's glad I'm here." The captain's eyes twinkled. Gilders said in a calm voice, "Mr. Crash, I can see you haven't changed in the last year." Crash knelt beside the helmsman on one knee and wrapped an arm affectionately around his neck. "Yes, I'm thankful to say you're right. You haven't changed either. Just as spontaneous and joyful as ever." Without losing his composure, Gilders pried the pilot's arm from his neck. "I'm thankful to say you're right." I took pity on the older man. "Crash, hadn't you better go say hello to Elmira?" "Whoa, not so fast." Standing, Crash faced the captain and transformed into the professional pilot. "What's your heading, and why are you going through uncharted sectors?" "Alpha 5433. We had some apparent reactions to our probes there, so we're on our way to have a look. This is the shortest route, and you know the owner doesn't like to be kept waiting. We're already having trouble with one of the smaller thrusters." "Remind me, this is the 100th time you've had so-called reactions?" I was afraid the captain might launch into a long discussion on the subject of the probability of life on other planets, but he only laughed and said, "Only the 23rd, Mr. Crash. And don't be the skeptic. I have enough of that with your uncle." "I am my uncle's nephew, Captain." "Forgive me, I didn't know. Spare me the debate. I've had my fill for today." "You talked to Uncle about it?" "You might say he talked to me about it." "I thought as much." Crash winked at me again. "One of these days you'll give up and you'll have to admit we're right." The captain would have retaliated if it weren't for the interruption of the science exec at that moment. "Obstruction ahead, Captain." "Element scan, Mr. Wales." "Aye, sir." "Propulsion 10, Mr. Gilders." "Adjusting to IPP 10, sir." "We'll discuss this later, Mr. Crash," the captain took the time to say. Then he turned back to the 4. "Mr. Gilders, prepare to maneuver around the object." Gilders switched control from navigation to the helm, and I relaxed somewhat. Navigation was not my favorite task. "We're still out of range of the comm towers," the captain clarified. "Yes, sir. We won't be in range again for another Mr. Yannendale checked his computer. 5 sectors. 5 sectors. That was about 5,000 light years. A long time to go without being able to communicate with Earth or any distant ships.
Andy, no records for this area in the database?
I leaned forward and scanned the records upon which navigation depended. No, sir. We just passed the last officially charted sector in this direction. The captain leaned back in his chair and muttered an oath.
We should have gotten records from the Comet 3 before we went out of range.
Should we turn back, sir? Gilders asked.
No. Let's just see what it is first.
Crash stepped to the captain's side and said,
Request permission to operate the helm, sir.
I groaned inwardly. Not again. Glancing at Gilders, I watched in vain for a change of expression. The captain seemed to hesitate, but finally said,
Mr. Gilders is doing a sufficient job, Mr. Crash. I don't see the need, but I do. If we're approaching a nebula or an asteroid belt, you're going to need someone with experience. Mr. Crash, our helmsman has had ample experience.
But not in this area.
If I'm correct, sir, the surveyor has never ventured beyond sector 4810 in this direction. You are correct. Nevertheless, I do not see the need to change helm control at this time.
But Captain,
Mr. Crash, I believe the answer I gave you was no. The captain raised his voice. If that is not sufficiently clear... 4 minutes to impact, came the science exec's voice. Instruments aren't finished registering. Slow to propulsion 5. Aye, sir. Power up the navicomputer, Andy, and plot a course to the edge of this sector.
Yes, sir. I sat up and began to follow his command. The navicomputer always took some time to compute a safe course, so I was surprised when, moments after I'd told it to begin plotting, it beeped at me. I read the error message from the panel aloud. Error. Computation impossible. Cluster approaching mark 104.57. The captain frowned.
Cluster?
Confirmed, spoke up Mr. Wales. Space trash ahead, various elements.
Anything dangerous? The captain asked.
No, sir, but it's large. At least 90 astronomical units.
90? Are you sure?
Cluster visible, announced Gilders, who hadn't spoken during the discussion about helm control. I looked up and watched as the massive field of trash came into view. Asteroids mainly, at least that's all I could pick out. We were still a few thousand kilometers away from it, and already it spanned the entire 4 window. The captain paused for half a second before ordering, Propulsion to 1, Mr. Gilders. I watched as the rapid approach of the cluster slowed to a crawl, wondering what the captain's decision would be. If the cluster were stable, an asteroid belt, or a small system, then it would have only taken a few minutes, even seconds, to go around it at almost any warp factor. But the instability of the trash made it more difficult. Warp was dangerous because one of the rocks might jump out in front of us, resulting in a crash that would probably be fatal. Using plasma propulsion, however, would take hours, and we were on a tighter schedule than usual with one thruster out of commission. The owner of the Surveyor was not a particularly patient man, and I knew that Captain Trent's punctuality was one thing that had kept him in command for so many years. I turned to look at his face as he pondered. He took so long that Gilders dared prompt, Parabolic course, Captain. No one except Gilders or the doctor would have been allowed such a liberty. The captain sighed.
I don't suppose it's safe to go through?
No, sir, Gilders answered.
Trent, Crash broke in. I've gone through trash field safely before.
There was a silence on the bridge for a few seconds. Then the captain shook his head.
No, we'll go around. What velocity do you recommend, Mr. Gilders?
I'd be confident at IPP 5, sir.
Very well. IPP 5 and keep a sharp eye. Andy, be ready to plot course to the next sector once we're on the other side.
Yes, sir. I'd already set the destination, so there was nothing more I could do until Gilders had worked his maneuvering magic.
Wait.
Crash again. I frowned, wondering at his persistence. Did he not trust Gilders? Or was he just trying to prove himself?
Mr. Crash, I can take us around at IPP 10.
There was another momentary pause. The captain stared. Gilders didn't turn around, didn't twitch an eyebrow, nothing. Crash was an exceptional pilot. No one could dispute that, but Gilders had years more experience. I bit my lip.
Stability level of the field, Mr. Wales, the captain requested. Calculating level 2, sir.
Level 2. Extremely unstable. He hesitated another moment, then cleared his throat and finally said,
Very well, Mr. Crash.
I felt for Gilders as he stood up and stepped aside. His face showed no anger or frustration, but I knew he must be hurt by the decision. It wasn't my place to remark, however, so I kept silent and turned my face towards the fore. Crash slid deftly into the chair and laid his hands on the controls with a smile. Taking the control column with one hand, he reached to adjust the propulsion slider to 10. I gripped the navigation panel and tensed. Crash was good, but something didn't feel right. Cocky as he was, there was some kind of subtext to his insistence on taking the helm that I couldn't put my finger on. For some reason, he was out to prove himself. Smoothly, the ship accelerated, through the propulsion levels and up to 10. The massive trash cluster moved to the starboard window, and I barely felt the motion as Crash maneuvered us around it. I realized I had been holding my breath, and I let it out slowly as we moved by the trash. Sometimes a rock whizzed so close by the window that I winced a bit, but the path ahead stayed clear. Twice, a stray asteroid flew too close to us and the ship swung away, but we were moving so quickly that the danger was over almost before I'd noticed it. A thick silence and suspense hung over the bridge, and I stole a sidelong glance at Gilders. His eyes were focused on the floor window, and he didn't move. 74 AUs remaining, Mr. Wales announced from the science station. Good, the captain began, but at that moment a rock the size of the bridge swerved in front of us. I yelled, "Look out!" as Crash pummeled controls, but it was too late, and the asteroid slammed into the surveyor's main body.